Hey, all right. I thought I'd make this video just to reflect further on my own personal journey and how I went from someone who really was into apologetics and defending the faith from atheists and from people who believed in evolution, believed the world was really old and stuff, um, to not really identifying with that group anymore and being pretty okay with evolution and an old Earth. Um, And in class, we talked about this, and it sounded sort of like, oh, I just kind of went by who I was hanging around with. And there's definitely some of that force there. I think that's there for all of us. It's really good to think about, for your own self. And I do this too, is like, okay, do I want to just go along with this group of people that I now happen to be a part with on X or Y or Z? So it would be pretty unfortunate if I did just kind of find myself affiliating with people for professional reasons or something and then just adopt whatever they believed so that I could get along with them, or because just to conform with them, like we talked about with the Ash study. I don't want to do that. I want to be the person who in the Ash study says, B is shorter than C, because that's the way I see it. And I'm sure I do conform sometimes, but I strive to not. I kind of like the idea of the voice of the prophet. It's the one who tells other people that I don't see it the way that you see it. I think you're missing something. So how did I get to adopt these views, even with that being the case? I'll tell you. Just a couple of points. So there's three main pieces to my story that I'm going to go through. One is there's a period of time in my life where I started to reduce the extent to which my faith relied on intellectual arguments like apologetics. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then the second part is I had some experiences sort of encountering science more on its own terms than science as it was explained to me by apologists. So that's the second part. And the third part is I had this experience of learning about whether it was okay to let go of the literalness of the Bible, if it was okay to read the Bible in a more figurative way in some places, and if it was appropriate to do that. So that's the kind of three parts. And the last part I'll consider, evolution and an old Earth and an old universe. What's the scientific evidence that I'm aware of for that, and what should I make of it given the other parts of the story I've told you about? So the first part of the story is when I was in high school. This is about, when I used to be into apologetics, but how did I start to de-emphasize that in my faith? When I went to high school, I went to a public high school, and I was the only serious Christian that I knew of in my public high school. And I viewed the intellectual climate around me as hostile to my faith. I thought that there were, other people there that were anti-Christianity, and if they knew, I was a Christian, should I come out? I remember wearing a shirt with Jesus on it once, and I was like really, nervous that people were going to be judging me and stuff. I used to read stuff like Lee Strobel, The Case for Faith, and William Lane Craig and other apologists. One time I brought a packet of information to my AP biology teacher on how the Miller-Urey experiments were a sham. These were experiments showing how life could have arisen from non-life, like amino acids forming and stuff. And she kind of put it on her desk, and she muttered something about it being creationist propaganda. That's probably the first time I had heard someone really dismiss the whole apologetics movement that I guess I was sort of a part of, or interested in at least. So, why was I reading all that stuff? I think I found it really interesting, but I think I also had a lot of doubts about my faith, and I was hoping to find answers to those doubts so that they wouldn't gnaw at me. But I was sort of finding I was disappointed. I would read all these interesting and smart-sounding intellectual arguments, but they wouldn't really help me with a gnawing that I still experienced from those doubts. Fortunately, at that time, I think God was working on me in that season of my life, and there were a couple of important people in my life at that point. My pastor and my grandmother, who I noticed their faith was something that I wanted to have. They weren't too bothered by the gnawing of doubts, I don't think, and they weren't very intellectual in their faith. perfectly intelligent people, but they didn't have a lot of intellectual emphasis when they talked about their faith. It's more about experiencing God and trusting God, seeing that God came through for them and stuff in their lives. So I decided I wanted to focus more on that, to try to develop that sense of experiencing God and trusting Him in my life. Not so much being right or eradicating my doubts, but to make the focus on my faith in trusting God. And I found that I had experiences of trusting God and having Him come through for me. And those were just as powerful emotionally as the gnawing doubts that I have, and even more powerful than them. So even though I still have times when I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem to make sense, and doubts will occasionally still gnaw at me, not as bad as when I was younger, but those aren't as powerful as the times when I have a real deep feeling that, God is there, and, He cares about me and things like that. I can't prove any of it. I kind of stopped trying to do that. But those are my experiences, and that's kind of what I run on for my faith. So that's phase one, is sort of de-intellectualizing my faith to a large degree. Of course, I'm sure not to a complete degree. This phase two is starting to experience science on its own terms. So a lot of this apologetic stuff I was reading was when I was in high school, and a lot of what I knew about the universe and physics and stuff was through Christians or apologists who would explain stuff to me the way that they thought it should make sense to defend the faith. When I got to college, I met a guy named Russ Camp, and he was a biologist. He was a professor at Gordon, where I went to college, and he knew a ton about cells and developmental biology. Those were the two classes I took with him, cellular and developmental biology, and taught me how to use an electron microscope and stuff. It was awesome. And he believed in evolution. And I was like, that's funny. This guy's clearly a devout Christian, and he doesn't seem to agree with some of the apologists that I'd been reading. So I was just kind of like, noted that apparently there's people that are part of this Christian world really trying to follow Jesus, and they don't buy into the arguments that I had been reading in high school. So I said, why not join along with him? And after I went to college, my first job was at McLean Hospital, part of Harvard Medical School, and I was working for a guy named Yu Chen who believed in evolution, and he was not a Christian, but I found that it was useful to be able to talk from an evolutionary perspective with him and kind of gain some respect that way, I think. And so I said, why not join this group of people, these scientists who I'm now working in my early 20s in research and stuff? Why not kind of join the popular view in that crowd, which is to believe in evolution? And then I might have said to myself at that time, oh yeah, the reason not to do that is that the Bible says the world was created in 6 days. And it says people didn't die until Adam and Eve sinned. And after that, after Adam and Eve, there were only like 8,000 years until Jesus. So there's definitely not enough time, if you read the Bible literally, for evolution to have happened. So that would be why not to just join people like Russ Camp and my new boss, Yu Chen. Because the Bible seems to say that there's no way evolution happened. Evolution requires a lot of death, a lot of different generations for millions of years probably. And that's not the way the Bible describes life coming to be the way that it is. So I was sort of stuck, but then a follow-up question might have been, is there a reason to believe that it might be okay to let go of those literal interpretations of the Bible about days and years in Genesis and Matthew and stuff? And I had heard arguments like that when I was at Gordon from Bible professors and stuff, kind of debating, whether the world really was meant to be suggested to have been created in 6 days, or was it 6 times or eras or something. So I was sort of like, I wonder the extent to which it might be okay to let go of those literal interpretations. That way I could join along with people like Russ Camp, who seems like a fine guy and a smart fella, and I could I could adopt evolution, which is kind of the popular view in this crowd that I now find myself in. So let's move to that section next, which is what was the journey for kind of letting go of the literalness of the Bible. This is something that has happened over a long period of time, probably since I was in college. I think when I went to college at the beginning, I remember the first week, even before college, I went on La Vida, and this trip, in backpacking, and there was a guy in my group who, I forget what we were talking about, but we were arguing something, debate about the Bible and stuff and how to apply it, and it was a great week. I loved being able to talk about God and Christianity with a bunch of smart people, really awesome people too, really nice people in my La Vida group. And to end the debate, he kind of crushed everyone where he said, listen, if you start interpreting the Bible, it's a slippery slope or something. And we were all like, oh, yeah, you're right. And he kind of won the debate with that statement. But so at the beginning of college, I was agreeing with him, and I was like, oh, yeah, we want to be as literal as we can with the Bible. But over the years since then, I've realized that it was actually a pretty naive statement that my La Vida made there. Because we are interpreting the Bible. We might just not realize it. At the end of the day, there's this huge cultural divide between us in New England in 2026 and the people that wrote the Bible 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And there's a guy named John Walton who's a really good writer about this. If you're interested, he is a professor at Wheaton College, and he talks about the cultural river that we live in. And that's kind of our world, is the cultural river. We know what TikTok is. We know what a phone is. We know what it means if someone goes biking or if they ride a Harley, the difference there between biking and biking. We know all sorts of stuff like that. Someone from Israel 2,000 years ago wouldn't get all those things that I just said. And the folks who wrote the Bible under the Holy Spirit's inspiration had their own cultural rivers. So there's lots of different things in the Bible that it's really helpful to understand the cultural rivers of the people who wrote it, so we can really get what is kind of initially in that text. It doesn't mean you can't read the Bible kind of naively, not knowing about the cultural river of the person that wrote it. You can definitely do that, and God can move through that. God can move through you reading the newspaper too. It's not a bad thing, but I think it's a good thing to understand the cultural river as much as we can, as much as time allows. So a good example of that would be in 1st or 2nd Corinthians. I remember learning about this, and this was a thing that made an impact on me in terms of letting go of the literal interpretations of the Bible and realizing how much the culture stuff matters. Is just 1st or 2nd Corinthians. I took a class on Corinthians when I was in college, and there's this passage in there where Paul talks about head coverings. He says women should cover their heads when they're in church, and men shouldn't have long hair, and they should not wear a head covering in church. And to this day, that affects our culture because the Bible is such an influential book in Western society that it's polite to take off your hat in a church. Especially, or any indoor building. I think a lot of that derives from this passage. But in that passage, Paul says something like, doesn't the very nature of things tell us that a woman should cover her hair and that a man shouldn't have long hair? And if you think about that long enough, you kind of start to say, actually, no, it doesn't, Paul. I don't know what you're talking about, that women should cover their head and men shouldn't have long hair. That doesn't make sense. But in Paul's cultural river, it did make sense. The understanding for Paul, who was influenced by the Greek culture at that time and the Roman culture that came after it, Hippocrates' understanding of anatomy was popular at that time. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, the father of modern medicine. This guy Hippocrates believed that hair was essentially a secondary sexual characteristic. And for women, it was important to have long hair for that sexual organ to work well. It was supposed to help her to get pregnant, basically, if she had long hair. And men, it would hurt them if they had long hair in the baby making process. So And that the same word for hair that Paul uses there is used for testicles and breasts in other contemporary writing. So you can look up head coverings and testicles or something like that. There's a scholarly article that I had to read in my Corinthians class back in the day that kind of convinced me of this being the case, is that, wow, Paul really lived in a different kind of medical world than I live in now. And that probably means I can wear a hat in church and not feel guilty about it. It probably doesn't matter, because I don't think the very nature of things is like, for us in our world, hair isn't a sexual thing. So it's okay if I cover my head, or even if I want to grow long hair, to the extent to which that is possible, which is really to no extent at all, because I'm going bald. But back in the day, I could have grown long hair and it wouldn't have been a big deal. And likewise, women having long hair and not covering it with a hat in church is not like being topless in church, which is essentially what I think it would have been like for Paul and for his people in his culture. So that's why he was talking about that. So that's just one example. There's another example of Abram when he cuts a bunch of animals in half and then makes this covenant with God. Why did he do that? Apparently that was a common way to make a covenant back then, and it's a really beautiful thing that God ends up walking through the animals, indicating, if this covenant be broken, then let me be torn asunder like these animals are. And then, of course, God comes through on that. If you're a Christian, where Jesus lays down his life, even though it was human beings are the ones who broke the covenant with God and didn't follow him like we should, God still laid down his life. He was torn asunder like that animals that Abram had cut in half long ago. So understanding the cultural river can really help us help us to understand where we might have been reading the Bible wrong, and where it can give us some more richness in terms of really understanding what's really deep, beautiful things are there in the Bible. So getting back to what we're talking about and believing in evolution or not, and believing, what do we believe about like the first few chapters of Genesis where the creation story is. John Walton in his book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, talks about that. And, he makes the argument very convincingly that it's not describing the mechanisms by which the physical world was made. The world for ancient people was not a machine like it is for us. That's sort of a metaphor for how we view the machine after the Enlightenment and this kind of science glorifying world that we live in now. How does it work? How do the pieces fit together? If I really want to understand something, I take it apart and I understand how one thing leads to another and cause and effect and stuff. That's how we feel understanding should work in our society post-Enlightenment. But that is not how the people who wrote Genesis and the people who heard the Genesis story would have thought. They thought of the world as a kingdom. And Genesis is telling how the kingdom became ordered in the way that it is. In the beginning, of the story, the Lord is hovering over the waters, and there's darkness, and those are both symbols of chaos in the ancient world, darkness and water. And God puts a stop to some of the chaos by giving us light and by giving us land. So that's the type of story that we're talking about. It's not intended to go through step by step. This is the process by which God made the world. It's more, here's a story about how the world is ordered by God. So to me, that means there's a lot of room for the possibility that this story of Genesis is not meant to be taken literally. And it wouldn't have been taken literally probably by its early readers. Even the words Adam and Eve, Adam just is the Hebrew word for man, and Eve means woman. It doesn't seem like it's necessarily trying to tell you about two historical figures. It's more the first man and the first woman. Okay, so last section here, I just want to go through a couple of pieces of evidence of, okay, what does the evidence that I'm aware of seem to indicate in terms of evolution and the earth being old and the universe being old. Now that we've gone through, there's some Christians who seem to believe in evolution. Should I join that group of people and kind of do it the way that they do it? Or should I stick with the apologist way? What am I going to do? Well, it depends on how literal you want to take the Bible. And we just talked about that it makes sense to, at least in some places, be aware that the Bible wasn't intending to be taken literally in terms of describing how the world was made, atom by atom, or the timeline in which it was made. It seems like that's not what the authors of Genesis are trying to do, at least if you trust that guy John Walton, which I was really convinced by him. Okay, so last section. So evolution. So Darwin's initial observations were that animals in different parts of the world, he was going on his Beagle ship around South America, and he made his observations mostly on that trip before he got to the Galapagos Islands, which I think might have been at the end of the trip, or maybe he went back there later. But he thought that animals in different parts of the world, like in South America, might have common ancestors with similar animals in other parts of the world, but they adapted to their environments over time. It was just this interesting observation that he made. They have different types of deers and different types of little rodent things in South America than we have up in England, where he was from. He wasn't out to get Christians or out to get the Bible. It's just these observations he made that were really interesting. And it's an amazing idea, actually, that the variety of animals that we see isn't an utterly mysterious thing. Like, where did all these different kinds of animals come from? It could be happening, or it could be the result of a process that's happening right now, just more slowly than we can perceive. Each generation, animals might be shifting a little bit. Or maybe they don't shift a ton when life is going well, but when life gets really tough because of a drought or something, then they start to adapt across generations a little bit more rapidly. So that's just the idea. And that certainly makes sense that could be happening. It's tough to test that directly, though, isn't it? That since it takes much longer than a human lifetime for things to evolve, usually. There are some examples where we can see it. See evolution happening within our lifetime, and COVID would be a good example of that, where this virus started out in one particular way and it was quite deadly at first, but within a couple of years it evolved, because viruses replicate so quickly. It evolved into something that was much less deadly. There's other examples like that too. Bacteria and treatment-resistant bacteria, is it something that's happening because of evolution? So that's a little bit about evolution. Of course, it could be wrong. It could definitely be wrong. But given what we just talked about whether we should take the Bible literally, should we think that it's wrong, or should we say, oh, this seems possibly like it makes sense? Same thing with the old Earth. I think the evidence from geology does suggest that the Earth is very, very old, millions of years at least. And the idea for this evidence is that the same processes that are happening right now in deltas and lakes and ocean, where mud and sediment settles, and then it compacts at bottom layers under great weight and kind of solidifies into rock, that same process is what generated the layers of rock that we see in places like the Grand Canyon, where you can see all those layers that have been carved. The layers are visible because a river has carved through them over years, which is also something that has happened over many, many years, is that river carving through the layers of rocks is something that would have taken a very, very long time to occur. Of course, that could be wrong. Maybe there's something we're missing, the way we're calculating how long we think those sediments take to form rocks. This is not something I know a lot about, so it might be that the evidence is actually very, very strong there, but maybe somebody's missing something. But go back to the question again. Why would I want to push back on that? A lot of it hinges on whether I think I should take the Bible literally. And that's something we just discussed, that it doesn't seem like, to me at least, that's an appropriate thing to do. For the story of creation, at least. There are parts of the Bible that are trying to tell history, and those I think are meant to be taken literally, but not this one, from what I've learned. So finally, the old universe, and this one's pretty simple. Is the universe very old? And this would be a problem if you took Genesis literally, because it seems like on day one God created light, day two what did he create? The land there, and then you do the math, and he should have created the universe like 10,000 years ago or something. If you do the math, but if you trust that scientists are able to estimate with any degree of accuracy the distance of stars, and you also accept, and they're billions of light years away is what that estimate is for some stars, and you also accept that light does in fact travel at the speed of light, that scientists have accurately estimated how long it takes light to travel somewhere, then every time you look up into the night sky, you're proving that the universe is billions of years old, because the light from that star is entering your eye. The star is billions of light years away. So it must have began its journey billions of years ago. And if it began its journey billions of years ago, then it's part of the universe, and the universe must be billions of years old. And of course, that could be wrong. There could be an erroneous assumption in there. But again, given what I said about letting go of the literalness of the Bible, this has been something that I've been okay with. It's not something that I'm seeing a reason to put up a stink about. At the end of the day, I think the most important thing is that for this video is that this is just my story. This is kind of how I got to be where I'm at with evolution, and with the universe being old. But I want to be very clear that I would love to serve alongside in a church with someone who totally disagreed with me on this, who was still really into the apologetics, or maybe they started the opposite and now they're into apologetics, and they don't accept evolution. I don't see it as something that is really that big of a deal, but it sometimes causes strife for people, like, which camp are you on? So I just wanted to tell my story in hopefully a way that is not combative, so you can hear this one story amongst the many that are out there. Thanks for listening. I hope it's somehow helpful for you in your story with what to make of this stuff.